Coda was already at the north fence when Mason Reed noticed the silverback pressing 2 fingers into the dirt beside an old cedar stump, lifting them to his nose, then reaching through the grass as if searching for something that should have been there. It was 4:48 p.m. at Redwood Ridge Wildlife Sanctuary in Oregon, less than 20 minutes before the public trails closed, and nothing beyond that section of fencing should have interested him. No food carts used the service road. No keepers entered through the rusted gate. The nearest gorilla was nearly 70 feet away, tearing lettuce beside a climbing platform. Yet Coda ignored the group and remained fixed on that empty corner. Mason slowed beside the keeper station, expecting the gorilla to lose interest. Instead, Coda sat down with his shoulder toward the fence and stared through the mesh at the narrow service road beyond it. A maintenance pickup rolled past in the distance. Coda immediately raised his head. His body went still until the truck disappeared behind the trees. Then he lowered his gaze again. That was when Mason checked his notebook. Tuesday, 4:51. Wednesday, 4:46. Thursday, 4:50. Friday, 4:49. Coda had been coming here at almost the same time every afternoon. Mason had initially treated it as a harmless change in routine. Gorillas noticed patterns, sounds, smells, staff movements, even subtle changes around an enclosure. But this pattern had another detail Mason couldn't fit anywhere: Coda never stayed after 5:10. At 5:07 that evening, the silverback rose, brushed loose soil from his knuckles, and walked back toward the others without looking behind him. The following afternoon, Mason changed the routine. He asked another keeper to move the produce cart 30 minutes early and kept the service road clear. By 4:40, the north side was quiet except for wind pushing through Douglas fir branches and the distant clatter of a latch near the indoor holding area. Coda was resting near a log when Mason glanced at his watch. 4:47, the gorilla stood. He crossed the grass without approaching the food station and headed directly north. Mason felt the first real edge of unease. Coda stopped at precisely the same patch of ground. This time, however, he didn't sit. He leaned forward and listened. A faint metallic rattle came from somewhere beyond the fence. Coda answered with a low rumble. Mason stepped closer to the observation window. The sound hadn't come from an animal. It seemed to have come from the old service gate, a gate staff hadn't used in years. Mason radioed the maintenance office and asked whether anyone was working outside the enclosure. The answer came back immediately: no crews, no deliveries, no scheduled work anywhere near the north road. Coda moved along the fence until he reached a weathered boulder half hidden beneath ferns. He lowered himself beside it and began carefully pulling dead leaves away with the backs of his fingers. He wasn't digging wildly or displaying agitation. He was clearing the ground. Leaf by leaf. Pine needle by pine needle. Mason watched a narrow patch of dark soil appear beside the stone. Then Coda stopped. His attention shifted beyond the fence again, toward a bend in the service road that disappeared into the trees. For nearly a minute, he simply listened. Mason heard nothing except a crow somewhere above the enclosure and the soft hum of an electric utility cart near the visitor center. Then Coda made the same low rumble and placed one hand flat against the boulder. Mason's radio crackled. Claire Bennett, the sanctuary veterinarian, was asking why he had requested the old Northgate maintenance records. Mason reached for the radio but didn't answer. Something had caught the fading sunlight beneath Coda's fingers. A thin edge of metal was sticking out of the soil. Coda touched it once, pulled his hand away, and stared toward the empty road. Mason looked at his watch. 4:45 p.m. Then, from somewhere beyond the locked gate, 2 short notes of a whistle carried through the trees, and Coda was on his feet before Mason could even turn toward the sound. Coda did not move toward the whistle. He remained upright beside the boulder, shoulders high, listening until the last note disappeared into the trees. Mason searched the service road through the mesh, but there was no movement beyond the locked gate. When he looked back, Coda had lowered himself again. The silverback touched the exposed strip of metal with one fingertip, then covered it with 2 dry leaves as carefully as he had uncovered it. A few minutes later, he walked away. At the evening feeding, Coda behaved normally. He chose romaine before carrots, carried an apple to the wooden platform, and sat with his back against a post while the younger gorillas moved around him. Mason watched from the keeper corridor. There was something unexpectedly gentle about the way Coda ate the apple. He took several bites, inspected what remained, then set the last piece beside his foot instead of finishing it. A juvenile named Tavi eventually approached and took it. Coda barely glanced down. But when a keeper accidentally dropped a stainless steel scoop against the concrete, Coda immediately turned his head toward the north side of the enclosure. The reaction lasted only a second. By the time Mason noticed it, Coda was eating again. The next day passed quietly. Coda spent the morning foraging through wood chips scattered with sunflower seeds, rested beneath the shade structure after noon, and later carried a frayed burlap sack to a patch of sunlight. He folded it beneath one arm before lying down, an ordinary little preference the staff had seen countless times. Nothing about him suggested distress. Yet shortly after 4:30, Coda abandoned the sack where it lay. He crossed toward the north side but stopped halfway. A visitor on the public path had whistled to a child. Coda froze. His eyes moved toward the sound. He waited several seconds, then continued walking only after the voices faded. Mason wrote nothing in his notebook this time. He simply followed at a distance. At the old gate, Coda sat with one hand resting near the boulder. He did not uncover the metal. He seemed more interested in the road. A breeze carried the smell of wet cedar through the fence, and Coda lifted his face into it. For a moment his expression softened, his lips relaxed, and he released a quiet breath. Mason found himself wondering whether Coda was expecting something familiar or merely responding to a pattern humans had not yet noticed. Then Coda did something Mason had never recorded there before. He shifted several feet to the left and left an empty space beside the boulder. He stayed that way for almost 10 minutes. There was enough room beside him for another gorilla, but none came. Near 5 o'clock, Tavi approached from behind carrying a strip of cardboard. Coda looked at the juvenile, gently took the cardboard, and placed it in the empty space. Tavi retrieved it immediately and wandered off. Coda did not stop him. Still, his eyes returned to that bare patch of ground twice before he left. The small gesture stayed with Mason long after the enclosure lights dimmed. The following afternoon brought a light Oregon drizzle. Coda arrived later than usual, his dark coat beaded with rain. Instead of sitting, he traced his fingers along the lower edge of the boulder until they reached the place where the metal lay hidden. This time he pulled it farther from the soil. Mason could finally see that it was not a random scrap. One end curved like a broken clip, and beneath the rust were 2 shallow stamped marks. Coda turned it once between his fingers, sniffed it, then set it down. Claire had joined Mason behind the observation glass. Neither spoke. Coda looked past them toward the service road and gave a low, soft vocalization. Seconds later, another gorilla answered from across the enclosure. Coda ignored the reply. His attention remained outside. Then Claire noticed something Mason had missed. Bolted to a cedar post beyond the old gate, almost hidden beneath moss, was a small rectangular box with a cloudy plastic cover. She brought up the sanctuary property map on her tablet. According to the current plans, nothing was supposed to be mounted there. Mason waited until Coda returned to the group before walking around to the exterior service road. Up close, the box was older than he expected. Its cover cracked when Claire carefully lifted it. Inside was a faded electrical label, a disconnected wire, and a handwritten maintenance date from 23 years earlier. Below the date were two initials. Mason looked through the fence toward Coda, now sitting quietly with Tavi near the platform. The same two letters were stamped into the metal Coda had uncovered, D.H. Claire photographed the initials but left the old box exactly where they had found it. There was no reason yet to disturb anything, and Mason wanted to know whether Coda would behave differently if the enclosure remained unchanged. The next afternoon gave him an answer he had not expected. At 4:43, Coda walked north as usual, but instead of stopping beside the boulder, he passed it. He moved another 20 feet along the fence, paused near a maple tree, then returned to the boulder by the same route. He repeated the short trip twice. Mason checked the ground for food, insects, or unfamiliar scents. There was nothing obvious. Then Coda picked up a fallen branch and carried it back to the old gate. He laid it across the ground, almost parallel to the fence, and sat behind it. The behavior was calm, but new. Claire wondered whether the branch was simply enrichment Coda had chosen for himself. That explanation lasted until the following day, when the branch had been moved during morning cleaning. Coda reached the north corner at 4:46, noticed it was gone, and searched the grass until he found another piece of wood of roughly the same length. He carried it to nearly the same position. Mason asked the cleaning crew to leave the area untouched from then on. Coda was not building anything recognizable, but he was repeating a placement. 2 days later, the pattern changed again. A delivery van stopped briefly on the service road beyond the trees. Coda rose before the vehicle became visible. He moved toward the gate, listened, then stepped backward when the van passed without stopping. He did not display or call. Instead, he returned to the branch and rotated it several inches with one hand. Mason felt his earlier theory slipping away. If Coda was responding only to engines, why did most vehicles receive no reaction at all? Claire began logging sound, wind direction, staff traffic, and vehicle type beside the time of each visit. Nothing lined up. A utility cart passed and Coda ignored it. A pickup slowed and he ignored that too. Then, late Friday, a sanctuary employee walked along the closed service road carrying a metal thermos clipped to his belt. The loose cap tapped twice against the bottle as he walked. Coda crossed half the enclosure before the man had taken 10 steps. Mason radioed him to stop. The employee froze, confused. When the tapping stopped, Coda stopped too. He stood about 30 feet from the fence, listening. Mason asked the employee to continue walking. 2 metallic taps sounded again. Coda moved forward. Claire lowered her clipboard. Whatever Coda was tracking seemed less connected to a person than to a combination of small sounds. Yet the next afternoon challenged even that idea. Mason placed a harmless metal carabiner outside the gate and gently tapped it twice against a steel post while Coda was elsewhere. Coda heard it. His head turned, but he did not approach. Mason tried once more several minutes later. Nothing. Claire told him to stop. They were not going to manufacture a response that was not there. At 4:45, Coda arrived on his own. He touched the branch, checked the soil beside the boulder, then walked to the section of fence directly opposite the moss-covered electrical box. For the first time, he reached neither toward the metal fragment nor toward the road. He sat and placed both hands on the ground. A minute passed. Then another. Mason noticed Coda occasionally tilting his head toward the cedar post as if sorting through distant sounds. At 4:52, a gust moved through the trees and shook the old box. Something loose inside produced a faint double click. Coda immediately stood. He picked up the branch he had positioned days earlier and carried it to the fence. Instead of dropping it, he pushed one end through the lower mesh until several feet extended onto the service road side. Mason and Claire exchanged a look. Coda adjusted the angle, pushed again, and let go. The branch now pointed toward the cedar post. Then Coda returned to the boulder, uncovered the rusted metal piece, carried it to the fence, and placed it carefully beside the branch. He stepped back several feet and waited. For the first time, Mason had the uncomfortable impression that Coda was not searching the north corner at all. He was arranging something there. But before Mason could decide what that meant, Coda crossed to the enclosure door and did something neither keeper had seen him do during these afternoon visits. He retrieved his burlap sack, carried it all the way back to the north fence, spread it on the ground beside the empty space, and sat down on only half of it, leaving the other half completely clear. By Monday, the empty half of Coda's burlap sack had become the detail Mason could not stop thinking about. The sanctuary team, however, had a more immediate problem. A facilities inspection had flagged the north service gate for replacement. The hinges were badly corroded, the cedar post supporting the abandoned electrical box had softened near the base, and winter storms were only weeks away. The recommendation was ordinary and responsible: remove the post, replace the gate, level the ground around the boulder, and install new fencing. Work could begin Thursday. Mason read the notice twice. Under normal circumstances, he would have signed it without hesitation. That afternoon, Coda arrived at 4:47 and found a bright orange survey ribbon tied outside the fence. He stopped several yards earlier than usual. The ribbon fluttered in the wind. Coda moved closer, examined it from inside the enclosure, then went directly to the boulder. He uncovered the rusted metal piece and held it for several seconds before setting it beside the branch. Mason felt a quiet discomfort settle over him. Coda could not know what the ribbon meant, but something about the changed corner had already altered his routine. Claire understood Mason's concern, yet she could not justify delaying necessary repairs based on a pattern they still could not explain. The old post was deteriorating. The gate no longer met current sanctuary standards. Leaving them in place simply because Coda visited the area would not be responsible animal care. She suggested preserving the loose objects and recreating the resting area 20 feet away after construction. It was a reasonable compromise. Mason wanted it to feel reasonable. The next day, staff placed temporary markers around the future work zone outside the enclosure. Coda arrived, noticed them, and did not sit on the sack. Instead, he walked the length of the marked section 3 times, stopping wherever the new fencing would begin and end. He remained calm, but his usual sequence had disappeared. He never touched the branch. He never uncovered the metal. At 5:11, when he normally would have returned to the group, he was still there. Mason waited another 10 minutes before gently calling him toward the indoor area with the familiar evening routine. Coda eventually followed, but halfway across the grass he turned around and went back to retrieve the burlap sack. He carried it inside with him. That small choice gave Mason hope that perhaps the place itself was not essential. Maybe the sack had become the important object. The hope lasted until the following afternoon. Coda brought the sack back out, crossed directly to the north fence, and spread it in exactly the same location. The orange ribbon had been moved overnight by the facilities crew. Coda found it lying near the fence and pushed it aside. Then he sat on half the sack again. The other half remained empty. Claire watched from the corridor without speaking. Mason finally asked for a 48-hour delay so they could review older records before construction. The facilities supervisor agreed to 1 day, but no more. A contractor had already scheduled equipment and staff, and postponing the project would affect several other repairs before the rainy season. Mason spent that evening searching digital archives. He found enclosure maps, veterinary logs, feeding schedules, and photographs, but nothing explaining the initials or the north corner. Near midnight, he found one promising reference to archived personnel materials stored off-site. The boxes could not arrive until Friday. Construction was scheduled for Thursday morning. Mason sent the request anyway. On Wednesday afternoon, clouds pressed low over the sanctuary. Coda reached the fence at 4:44. The old branch had been removed for safety before the contractors arrived, and the metal fragment had been collected by Claire for examination. For the first time, there was almost nothing left beside the boulder. Coda searched the leaves once, then sat on the bare ground. He did not bring the sack. At 5 o'clock, Mason saw a facilities worker attach a white notice to the exterior gate. Work area closed. Coda heard the paper snap in the wind and moved closer to the fence. He rested one hand against the ground where the metal piece had been. Mason called the operations office one final time, hoping the schedule had changed. It had not. At 7:30 the next morning, Coda would be shifted to the indoor habitat while the north corner was cleared. The cedar post, the old gate, the boulder, and the surrounding ground were all scheduled for removal before noon. At 7:12 Thursday morning, Mason stood outside the north enclosure with a paper cup cooling in his hand while the facilities crew unloaded tools from a white utility truck. The work had not started yet. Claire had asked for 15 minutes to photograph the old gate and document anything that might matter before it disappeared. She began with the rusted metal fragment Coda had uncovered. Under better light, the two stamped letters were clear, but another mark appeared beneath them, a shallow number 6. It could have been an inventory code, a locker number, or part of something larger. Claire turned the piece over. Along one edge was a narrow groove polished smoother than the surrounding metal, as though something had repeatedly rubbed against it for years. Before Mason could examine it further, a worker called from the cedar post. The cloudy electrical box was not connected to the enclosure system at all. Its wire ran downward through the post and ended less than a foot below the soil. Whatever the box had once controlled had been removed long ago. That weakened Mason's assumption that Coda was reacting to an old mechanical sound. The double click they had heard might have been nothing more than loose hardware. Yet when the worker removed the plastic cover, he found two tiny screw holes inside that did not match the remaining components. Something else had once been mounted there. Claire photographed them and asked the crew to leave the box intact. At 7:28, Coda entered the indoor habitat for breakfast. He accepted pieces of celery and bell pepper through the normal feeding routine, then settled near the rear platform. Mason expected him to become restless when the exterior gate opened. Instead, Coda appeared interested only when the workers carried the cedar post past the viewing corridor. He rose, moved closer, and sniffed the air through the barrier. He ignored the new steel gate lying on the cart beside it. That difference bothered Mason. If construction noise or change itself was the problem, both objects should have mattered. By 8:15, the old gate had been lifted from its hinges. Beneath one hinge plate, protected from decades of rain, the original green paint remained visible. Scratched into it were several maintenance marks and a date from 24 years earlier. Claire compared the date with the handwritten one inside the electrical box. They were only 3 days apart. That suggested the box, gate, and metal fragment might all belong to the same renovation period. It also made another theory less convincing. Coda had not been responding to some random object buried recently. Whatever connected these pieces had existed for most of his life. Mason asked the crew to pause before moving the boulder. The supervisor agreed while workers cleared vegetation around it. Beneath layers of moss, one side showed a straight pale line where something rectangular had apparently rested against the stone for years. There was no plaque now, only 4 small mounting holes. Claire measured the spacing. It matched nothing on the electrical box. Mason photographed the marks and searched the sanctuary database for old signs used in that enclosure. The records listed feeding instructions, safety notices, and visitor information panels, but none were mounted that low or that close to the service gate. At 9:17, his telephone buzzed. The off-site archive had located the personnel boxes earlier than expected, but the message included only photographs of their labels. One box was marked North Habitat, 1999 through 2004. Another carried the initials D.H. Mason enlarged the image, expecting a maintenance department code. Beneath the initials was a handwritten word too faded to read. Claire adjusted the contrast on her tablet. It looked like either training or transfer. Neither interpretation explained why the same initials appeared on a small piece of metal Coda had handled. Then one of the facility's workers called Mason back to the boulder. They had loosened the soil around its base but had not moved it. Wedged beneath the rear edge was a thin strip of weathered blue material. Mason crouched and carefully pulled it free. It was fabric, not plastic, faded almost gray after years underground. One end had a stitched seam. Claire studied it without touching. A uniform patch, perhaps. A tool pouch. Part of an old enrichment item. There was no way to know. Mason was about to place it in an evidence bag when he noticed 3 letters printed inside the seam in nearly vanished black ink. They were not D.H. They read K.O.D. And beneath them, written much smaller by hand, was a time, 4:45. Mason read the faded time again, then looked toward the indoor habitat. 4:45 was too specific to dismiss, but the fabric raised more questions than it answered. Claire photographed both sides before searching the oldest digital animal care records for anything connected to that hour. The database only reached back 18 years, so she called records management and asked them to open the North Habitat archive box immediately. 20 minutes later, scanned pages began arriving by email, keeper schedules, enrichment sheets, equipment lists, and handwritten daily logs. Mason searched for the initials first. Daniel Harper. The name appeared repeatedly beside Coda's records from more than 2 decades earlier. Daniel had been one of the keepers assigned to Coda during his first years at Redwood Ridge. But nothing in the notes described unusual training at the North Gate. Instead, the same ordinary sentence appeared again and again, 4:45, North check. Mason felt the pieces shift. The blue fabric was identified on an old equipment sheet as part of a canvas keeper pouch labeled KOD, shorthand for Coda's daily enrichment supplies. Daniel had carried it during the afternoon check. The rusted metal fragment was not a tag or a tool. An inventory photograph showed the original pouch with a small metal whistle case clipped to its strap. Stamped into that case were Daniel's initials and his locker number, D.H.6. The polished groove on the fragment matched years of movement against the clip. Claire went back to the photograph of the electrical box. The 2 empty screw holes suddenly mattered. An old maintenance diagram showed that the box had once held a simple gate buzzer. Keepers approaching from the service road pressed it before entering the controlled corridor. 2 short electronic notes. Not a signal trained specifically for Coda, just part of the routine surrounding Daniel's arrival. That was why Mason's imitation with the carabiner had meant nothing. Coda had never been waiting for 2 random metallic sounds. The sound belonged to a larger pattern: the road, the gate, the cedar post, the pouch, the time, and one familiar person appearing at the end of it. Mason opened another scanned log. Daniel's entries were remarkably plain. Weather cool. Coda calm. Enrichment completed. North check at 4:45. Page after page, week after week, the same rhythm. Then the entries stopped. The final page contained no dramatic explanation, only a supervisor's note stating that Daniel had begun extended medical leave and would not be returning to animal care duties. Another personnel document showed that his belongings had been cleared from the keeper area during the next renovation. The north gate was later taken out of regular use. The buzzer was disconnected. Part of the old pouch had apparently remained near the boulder, where years of soil and vegetation eventually covered it. Mason finally understood what they had been seeing. Coda had not been trying to uncover buried objects. He had not been reacting to construction, guarding territory, or arranging a mysterious collection. Each afternoon, he had been reconstructing pieces of a routine that no longer existed. The branch lay where the old access boundary had once guided keepers toward the gate. The metal carried the scent and shape of an object associated with that routine. The empty half of the burlap sack was not proof that Coda imagined a person sitting there, and Mason refused to pretend they could know exactly what the gorilla understood. But the repeated time and place were no longer random. Even Coda's reaction to vehicles made sense. He responded only when several familiar cues appeared together. Claire found one final archive photograph. Daniel sat outside the north barrier after his afternoon check, a blue pouch beside his boot. Inside the enclosure, a much younger Coda rested several feet away on a folded piece of burlap. Between them stood the same boulder. Mason carried the tablet to the indoor viewing window. Coda was sitting quietly on the other side, turning a piece of celery between his fingers. Mason held the photograph against his chest rather than showing it to him. For weeks, everyone had been asking what Coda wanted from that empty corner. Now Mason realized they had been asking the wrong question. Coda had never been asking the place to give him something new. He had simply kept returning when the old routine said someone should arrive. Claire looked at the clock above the keeper desk. It was 4:45. Coda stopped moving, lifted his head toward the sealed north side, and released one soft rumble into the quiet room. The rumble faded, but Mason stayed beside the viewing window long after Coda lowered his head again. On the desk behind him sat the work order he had approved 3 days earlier. Replace gate. Remove post. Level north corner. Each instruction had seemed routine when he signed it. Now he picked up the page, folded it once, and set it beneath the tablet displaying Daniel's photograph. Claire did not say that they had almost erased something important. She only reached for her telephone and asked facilities not to discard anything they had removed. The answer came back a minute later. The old gate and cedar post were still on the maintenance trailer. Mason closed his eyes for a second. That was enough. By late afternoon, the crew had agreed to store every original piece while the animal care team reconsidered the renovation plan. Safety requirements still had to be met, but nothing needed to go into a dumpster. Claire placed the rusted whistle case fragment in a small clear container and wrote the date beside Coda's identification number. Her handwriting stopped halfway across the label. She looked toward the enclosure, where Coda had moved beside Tavi. The younger gorilla leaned against his shoulder while Coda calmly stripped leaves from a stalk of celery. Claire finished the label more slowly. She had examined Coda for years, yet a few quiet visits to an old fence had revealed how much of his world remained invisible to them. The next afternoon, Mason carried the faded photograph to the keeper corridor but left it face down on the counter. He did not want to turn Coda's behavior into an experiment. No whistles, no recordings, no attempts to force a response. At 4:43, Coda was grooming his forearm near the climbing structure. At 4:45, he paused. The north corner was still closed for construction, hidden partly behind temporary panels. Coda looked in that direction, then remained where he was. Mason felt an unexpected ache at the sight. For the first time, Coda could not complete the routine even if he wanted to. A minute later, he picked up his burlap sack. He carried it toward the temporary barrier and stopped several feet short. The new fence prevented access to the boulder, so Coda lowered the sack onto the grass. He sat on one edge, leaving the familiar open space beside him. Mason turned away from the glass and pressed his thumb against the rim of his coffee cup. Claire stood beside him without speaking. There was nothing dramatic in the enclosure, only a gorilla sitting quietly on worn fabric while afternoon light faded across wet grass. Somehow that made it harder to watch. Tavi approached carrying a handful of wood wool and tried to settle beside Coda. Coda shifted slightly. For a moment Mason expected him to protect the empty portion of the sack. Instead, he allowed the juvenile to sit there. Tavi leaned against him, busy pulling fibers apart. Coda glanced toward the blocked north corner once, then began grooming the youngster's shoulder. Claire finally whispered, "Maybe that is enough for today." Mason nodded, though neither of them moved. That evening, Records Management sent one more file from Daniel Harper's personnel box. It was not an official report. It was a small photograph that had apparently been tucked inside an old staff notebook. Daniel was standing outside the enclosure holding the blue canvas pouch. On the back, in blue ink, he had written only 6 words, "Coda waited for me again today." Mason read the sentence twice. For years, Daniel had apparently believed the young gorilla was the one waiting for him. Now, more than 2 decades later, the words felt entirely different. Claire placed the photograph beside the recovered metal fragment. Mason looked through the window. Coda had finished grooming Tavi and was preparing to move inside with the group. Before leaving, he picked up the burlap sack, shook several pieces of wood wool from it, and carried it a few steps. Then he stopped, returned to the temporary barrier, and laid the sack carefully on the grass instead. He left it there. At 4:45 the following afternoon, Mason found Coda already sitting beside it. The renovation resumed with one quiet change. The new gate would still meet every safety requirement, but the crew shifted its footing several feet so the old boulder could remain. The cedar post was too damaged to return, so Mason asked them to preserve a section of it in the sanctuary archive. By Friday afternoon, the temporary panels came down. Coda approached the rebuilt corner cautiously, stopping where fresh gravel met the older soil. He touched the new steel once, smelled the ground, and moved toward the boulder. Mason watched from farther back than usual. Coda sat there for 9 minutes, then returned to the group without searching for anything. The next week settled into a gentler rhythm. Coda still visited the north side, but not every afternoon. Some days 4:45 passed while he remained with Tavi beneath the climbing structure. On others, he carried his burlap sack halfway across the grass, changed direction, and left it beneath a shaded platform instead. Mason stopped keeping a daily count. The notebook that had once recorded every arrival time remained closed in his locker. He had learned that watching too closely could turn an animal's ordinary choices into something humans wanted to interpret. Still, one question remained unfinished. Claire had located a current mailing address for Daniel Harper in Washington. Sanctuary Management contacted him carefully, explaining what they had found without promising what Coda remembered or how he might respond. Daniel answered 3 days later. He was 74 and had not visited Redwood Ridge in more than 20 years. He remembered the North Gate immediately. He remembered the blue pouch too. Most of all, he remembered Coda. When Mason spoke with him by telephone, Daniel was quiet for several seconds before asking one practical question: "Is he doing well?" Mason looked through the office window at Coda sharing scattered vegetables with the group. "He is," Mason said. Daniel visited the following Tuesday under the same rules used for any former staff member. There would be no entering the enclosure, no reaching through barriers, and no attempt to force contact. Mason met him near the administration building. Daniel walked with a slight stiffness and carried no gifts. In his jacket pocket was only an old employee badge the archive had returned to him years earlier. As they approached the service road, he slowed beside the cedar trees. The new gate was visible ahead. Daniel looked at it for a long moment, then smiled faintly at the boulder that had been left untouched. Coda was nowhere near it. He was almost 80 feet away, sitting with Tavi and pulling apart a cardboard tube filled with hay. Daniel did not call his name. He simply stood outside the designated barrier while Mason and Claire waited several steps behind. Minutes passed. Coda continued working at the tube. Daniel rubbed his thumb along the edge of his old badge and seemed almost relieved. "That is all right," he said softly. "He does not owe me anything." Then a maintenance cart turned onto the distant road. Its tires crunched over gravel. Daniel instinctively stepped aside, and as he did, he gave 2 short whistles under his breath, the casual sound of someone repeating a habit without thinking. Coda's hands stopped. The cardboard tube remained between them. He lifted his head, but he did not rush toward the fence. He listened. Daniel noticed and became completely still. Coda stood, walked several yards, stopped again, then continued toward the north side at an unhurried pace. Mason could hear Daniel breathing beside him. When Coda reached the boulder, he lowered himself onto the grass. Daniel sat on a bench outside the barrier. They remained separated by the secure fence and more than a few feet of space. Coda picked at a blade of grass. Daniel rested both hands on his knees. Nothing else needed to happen. After several quiet minutes, Tavi came wandering over and settled near Coda. Daniel smiled when he saw the younger gorilla. "You have company now," he murmured. Coda gave a low rumble and began grooming Tavi's shoulder. When Daniel eventually stood to leave, Coda stayed with the juvenile. He did not follow the service road with his eyes. The next afternoon, 4:45 came and went. Coda was nowhere near the north gate. Mason found him beneath the climbing platform with the burlap sack folded under Tavi's head. Daniel stayed at Redwood Ridge for 2 more days, but he never asked for another arranged meeting. He spent most of his time walking the public trails with Mason, stopping occasionally at places he remembered and occasionally at places he did not. The sanctuary had changed too much for every memory to fit. Near the north enclosure, he paused beside the preserved section of cedar post that maintenance had set aside. His fingers rested briefly on the weathered wood. Then he handed Mason his old employee badge. "Keep this with the other things," he said. Mason started to tell him he could take it home, but Daniel shook his head. The badge went into the archive beside the blue fabric, the broken whistle case, and the photograph from the old staff notebook. Claire added short factual labels to each item. She avoided words like memory, grief, or waiting. There was no way to know exactly what those years had meant inside Coda's mind. The records could establish the routine. His behavior could show that certain places, sounds, and objects still mattered. The rest belonged to Coda. On Daniel's final afternoon, he returned to the bench outside the north barrier shortly before 4:45. Coda was across the enclosure with the group. Daniel watched him for a while, then checked his wristwatch out of an old habit. 4:46. He smiled and slipped his hands into his jacket pockets. "Good," he said quietly. Mason understood what he meant. Coda did not come to the gate that afternoon. Daniel left Redwood Ridge before sunset. He did not whistle when he walked down the service road. Weeks passed, and Oregon rain darkened the new fence until it no longer looked quite so new. Grass began filling the disturbed soil around the boulder. Coda visited the corner occasionally, sometimes sitting there for a few minutes and sometimes passing it without stopping. Mason no longer followed with a notebook. If Coda chose the north side, he was allowed the same quiet he received anywhere else. Tavi often came with him now, usually bringing something inconvenient, a cardboard tube, a handful of wood wool, or a piece of burlap dragged through wet grass. One afternoon Mason noticed that the original sack had finally torn along its edge. He considered replacing it immediately, then decided to leave the choice to the normal enrichment rotation. Several days later, a fresh sack appeared in the habitat with the morning materials. Coda inspected it, used it briefly, and abandoned it near a log. Tavi claimed it before lunch. The old sack remained near the north side, faded and thin, until Coda eventually pulled it apart during ordinary play. No one tried to save the pieces. By early spring, visitors could stand near the public viewing area without knowing anything unusual had happened there. They saw a silverback moving through green grass, younger gorillas climbing nearby, and keepers doing the unremarkable work that filled most days at a sanctuary. The boulder was still there. So was the open patch beside it. On a cool afternoon, Mason was closing the keeper corridor when he noticed Coda walking north with Tavi a few steps behind. Coda reached the boulder and lowered himself onto the grass. Tavi sat close enough that their shoulders touched. For several minutes they remained there while the cedar branches moved above the service road. No vehicle came. No whistle sounded. Coda picked a small leaf from Tavi's back and rolled it between his fingers. Then he stood and began walking toward the others. Tavi stayed behind, distracted by something in the grass. Coda went several steps before noticing. He stopped and looked back. Tavi hurried after him. Coda waited until the youngster caught up, then continued across the enclosure at the same slow pace. Mason watched them disappear behind the climbing structure. He turned off the corridor light and pulled the door closed. Outside, the old boulder remained beneath the cedar trees, with no one sitting beside it and nothing left there to wait for. Thank you for watching until the end of the video.